Greetings, and welcome to this brief introduction to Plato's dialogue, The Lovers. Now, the importance of this dialogue is indicated by the subtitle given to it in antiquity, On Philosophy. Of course, every dialogue, insofar as it features Socrates, the philosopher, is somehow on philosophy, but apparently The Lovers makes philosophy its special focus. Now, Socrates narrates this dialogue to an unidentified listener or listeners at an unidentified time. So we don't know when the dialogue he narrated took place. We know where it took place, a grammar school where Plato himself was a student. Now there Socrates speaks with two boys. They know his name without his being introduced. We never hear their names. The two boys with whom Socrates speaks are rival lovers of two other youths whom they are watching discuss astronomy, that is, natural science. Soon all four boys are listening to the conversation with Socrates. An alternate title for this dialogue is The Rivals. Were the boys rivaling each other alone for the other youth's love, or also for Socrates' love? If so, they must have been disappointed, for Socrates tells his later listeners that he knows nothing of what lovers suffer. Socrates begins the dialogue by asking one of the two rivals, a boy who is devoted to gymnastics, whether the two youths that they're watching are doing something great and noble, a word that could also be translated as beautiful or fine. Blathering philosophy, the rival answers. Socrates marvels at this answer. He asks the boy if he believes philosophy is shameful. Now that same word could also be translated as ugly. At that point, the musical youth, the other's rival in love, interrupts. Socrates then asks the musical rival if he believes that philosophizing is noble or beautiful or fine. The musical rival strongly affirms that it is. The rest of the dialogue appears to turn away from this question of philosophy's nobility or beauty to the question of what philosophy is. But it does not simply abandon the question of philosophy's nobility. To the contrary, the dialogue that follows about what philosophy is aims to secure a definition of philosophy that satisfies the condition that philosophy be noble or beautiful. That condition is taken for granted from the beginning by the musical rival's answer. This unexamined condition, largely unspoken condition, is the yardstick against which they evaluate the answers that follow to the question of what philosophy is. Now, the rest of the dialogue falls into two main parts. The first, destructive, the second, constructive. In the first part, this destructive part, Socrates examines the musical rival's answer that philosophy is much learning, as he puts it. First, Socrates shows that the rival does not mean simply lots of learning. That would entail merely consuming information, and such piggishness would hardly be noble. Rather, he means measured learning, the right amount of learning. Now, where do you find this measure? That's not so clear, so they turn to the question of learning what? Here the rival answers that it is learning knowledge appropriate to a free man, which would allow him to evaluate and direct the various arts. Now, Socrates says he's intrigued by this answer, but it soon becomes clear that the rival means that the philosopher would know enough about each and every art to talk cleverly about it, but not as much as each artisan knows. So as long as an artisan is present, the philosopher is useless. For example, you'd call a doctor if you or a loved one is sick, not a philosopher. The philosopher is at best a second-rater, a dilettante. But the rival cannot accept that something useless is noble, so he seems stuck. Socrates then turns to the second, constructive part of the dialogue. Here he, Socrates, suggests that perhaps the learning the philosopher possesses is knowledge that would distinguish good from bad human beings, and so allow one to make human beings better. In a line of very dubious reasoning, the rival agrees that this knowledge would be tantamount to the knowledge of disciplining human beings, called justice, and would be the same as moderation, which is knowing yourself. It would, he says, apply the same to many human beings and to one human being, and would be equivalent to kingship, tyranny, statesmanship, household management, despotism, moderation, and justice. In short, it would be what we might call political philosophy. The philosopher would be no second-rater in this. But then at the very end, Socrates confronts the musical rival with his contradiction. This political philosophy looks noble, but it is not learning many things. It is knowing one thing. They seem at an impasse. The dialogue then appears aporetic, that is, without a solution. Paying attention to this ending is very important, for though the musical rival seems enchanted with Socrates' depiction of a sort of political philosophy, Socrates never identifies this art with philosophy. What then are we to make of this short, strangely unsatisfying dialogue about the central matter, philosophy itself? The key is the dialogue's insistence on approaching philosophy from the question of its nobility. The musical rival does not consider the possibility that philosophy may be neither shameful nor noble. He approaches philosophy, to which we could add the word science, with a moral commitment. It is a beautiful thing, a fine thing, worthy of our serious attention. What then does that mean? That philosophy or science be noble. It means, as Socrates brings out in the central part of the dialogue, that this pursuit is good, meaning useful for us human beings, not useless. But what use is it? Each of the arts, such as medicine or piloting, aims at some good, such as the health of the body or safe passage on the sea. It's tempting to say that philosophy aims at the whole human good, not in some partial sense, and above all, the good of the soul. Does this mean the good of my individual soul, just as gymnastic exercises presumably improve my individual body? If so, this learning may be very personally rewarding, but then why call it noble? It would seem nobler to speak of a learning that allows one to make many people good, for each other, in a community, that is, justice. But does this justice make each individual as good as possible for himself? Or rather, doesn't it trim or discipline each individual, just as a farmer does his field, or a herdsman does his herd? In short, through reading this little dialogue, we must face the possibility that if philosophy or science is moral, it cannot only serve the improvement of this one human being. That is, knowledge of this art of justice is perfectly consonant with serving others' goods. In contrast, insofar as it remains free, philosophy or science may yield its claims upon knowledge, power, and nobility. Thank you for joining this brief introduction to Plato's dialogue, The Lovers.